So let us bring in John Dickerson. He is the CBS News Chief Washington correspondent and, of course, also anchor of Face the Nation, joining us from Washington. So, John, of course, we have to start with that extraordinary press conference yesterday at Trump Tower. This is a hard question to ask. What stuck out to you the most?
Well, I think it's the lack of proportion. So the president's defenders will say that he denounced the white supremacists and the racists. And that's absolutely true. But he also, and in fact, seemed more exercised about fighting to the ground this point that there were some on the left who contributed to the violence, which takes out of shape the proportion that's required from a president in these kinds of moments, because the neo-Nazi protesters and the white supremacists are advocating for a set of ideas that are completely at odds with the American experience and the founding principles of the country that he is the leader of. And so you would, in a normal circumstance, expect a president to be full of blunt anger and force for the ideas that they were expressing, and then also use the moment to try to gather everybody to those central ideas of the American experience, to take this moment of tension and clash and say that Americans are better than this, and remind them why, and point them towards all that is good in the American life. Instead, the president was engaged in what felt at times like an argument on a chat show, where it kind of had lost the central theme of the moment and was down into this question of whether anybody on the left may have contributed to the violence, which diminished that larger, more important point.
John, the president said he didn't condemn these hate groups by name in his initial statement on Saturday because he didn't have all the facts. What do you make of that defense?
Well, a couple of things. One, he had the fact that there were neo-Nazis marching in Charlottesville. He boasted about how closely he was attending to the facts. And so had he been, he would have known that at the torchlight parade on Friday night, where they were shouting blood and soil, a Nazi slogan, Jews will not replace us. It was very clear what they were up to on Friday night. That could have received a denunciation as early as Friday. Then on Saturday, he may not have known the facts of the murder by car, but he certainly knew that these kinds of protesters were protesting, and that's what people were asking for from him. But more broadly, waiting until all the facts are in shows a kind of restraint on this issue, which is curious given that his stock and trade, his successful presidency or presidential campaign, was founded on speaking quickly and bluntly and not necessarily waiting around for all the facts to come in, because he understood, in the way he conveyed himself, a larger truth. And yes, some facts might come in that might be slightly contradictory, but he was able to put his finger on the larger truth. The larger truth here that most everyone sees is the vile beliefs of the people who were marching. And the fact that he was not able to seize on that and was waiting around for the facts is out of character with the Donald Trump everybody has seen for the last 3 years.
Indeed. I think some would argue that he could maybe take his own advice on other things and wait for all the facts before he tweets or makes a statement or so on and so forth. You know, what comes up a lot, too, is the idea of false equivalency. And we heard the president basically equate removing a statue of Robert E. Lee to removing a statue of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. Does the president need a history lesson?
Well, there are a couple of challenges with making that assertion. The first is that while it is true that that this march came out of or was connected to a move by the city of Charlottesville to remove the Robert E. Lee statue, that it then grew into and changed into something else. And so the question of the statue is probably one better left for another day, given the fact that neo-Nazis and white supremacists then seized the protest and it became something quite different. But nevertheless, on the question of history, the distinction and difference is that Robert E. Lee was in open rebellion of his country. He's not even referred to as a general up at West Point, where he attended school, because he was a general of the Confederacy, not of the American Army or of the Union Army. And so history is, George Washington, on the other hand, was not only a general, but was a founder of the country, and was the president who set the example for all who came after him. Quite a different career, and quite central to the foundation of the country. Robert E. Lee was central to the thing trying to break up that country. That's a very big difference. Though they both may have, though George Washington was a slave owner, that's not all this is about. And in fact, the comparison between the two shows a proportionality problem that is a part of the other issues at stake here as well.
John, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are speaking out against the president's comments, while former KKK leader David Duke is thanking the President of the United States. What are the implications of that moving forward when it comes to the president's legislative agenda?
Well, you never, as a president who's talking about race in America, want the imperial wizard of the KKK to ever receive any message that is favorable. And so this is not the first time this has happened. There was during the campaign. David Duke said that he supported Donald Trump and saw his candidacy as in line with his ideas. He has now said that after the election and in his presidency. So that is a big problem. And the effect here is not only Republicans who might abandon the president, but also bipartisan legislation that the president has authored, that the president supports. It's very hard to see how Democrats would say, well, okay, we'll get together and work on infrastructure. I mean, this is if for no other reason than their base finds this, thoroughly objectionable and has cause to, and so if you're a Democrat signing up with the president's program, which is what would be required to get it through the Senate, then your constituents are likely to be very upset with you.
And John, just to follow on that, we certainly have seen, and we just put up some tweets from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle condemning the racist bigotry, the fascist movement, the white supremacy movement. But there are some who are saying, look, these words, you see Marco Rubio there, he's actually called out the president. Mm-hmm. You see Chuck Schumer calling out the president. But for example, Paul Ryan does not name the president. And the question I guess a lot of people will have is, are Republicans still trying to walk that fine line in not completely repudiating everything the President of the United States said yesterday because they have loftier ideals which include their legislative agenda?
I think that's right. I mean, there may be a number of reasons they're being tentative here. They may also be worried about their own constituents who might turn on them and say, hey, you're piling on, and who might be likely to see this in a more favorable light. In other words, the president, was right. There were people contributing to violence on both sides, which is in fact true, but it's not the point. It's the smaller point, the larger point, the one that a president is supposed to be focused on, because in part what a president does is focus the nation on the big and important issue, is that these were objectionable and repulsive people, kind of full stop. You don't need to argue that side point. So, but that's nevertheless a view some supporters of the president may have, and then may think negatively of Paul Ryan or anybody else who doesn't call the president out. The problem and challenge for these Republicans, though, is that if they see the president on a trajectory, and he has been since Inauguration Day, where they have repeatedly had to answer for his statements or claims or the things he's done, do they at some point get to a point of no return, where if they were to ever officially break with the president, they would be condemned for it, because by that time people might say, what took you so long? Mm-hmm. And that's the balance that I know in talking to these lawmakers ever since Donald Trump was a candidate, who said, this has just gone too far, but only said it privately. These are the kinds of calculations they've been thinking about, and they're thinking about them again.
John, before we let you go, we have to talk about John Kelly. Everyone saw that image of him standing behind the president with his head bowed, looking very somber, very serious. This man was hired on as chief of staff with the expectation that perhaps he would be able to bring order to the office. And I understand he's not chief of staff of the president. He's chief of the president's staff. But can we draw anything from the level of influence he is having or not having when we look at that press conference yesterday?
Well, no chief of staff should have to micromanage a president's remarks about Nazis. That should be pretty basic. And that, in fact, it is the problem on that very basic question that's got the president in such a fix here. So it's not something any chief of staff could fix, in this specific case. But this specific case speaks to a larger challenge for the chief of staff, which everybody predicted from the minute he took the job, which is how much control does he have over the president? And the job of a chief of staff is to remind the president and keep the president aware constantly that while he may want to fight something because he finds it personally offensive, or he may want to argue something because he believes there's a principle at stake, that he's got a larger thing he has to worry about called the presidency, and that there are other issues and other people who work for him and a lot of other things going on, and sometimes the president has to just sit there and take it or not say the thing that he really wants to say because there's a big operation that the president is the head of. And that seems to be something that is very hard with this president, and even a Marine general can't work magic.
John Dickerson in Washington for us. John, as always, we appreciate the insight and the analysis. Thank you.
Sure thing.